Hello and welcome back to Economics on the Side, here with another book review of Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom. This one is chapter 5 and it's all about fiscal policy. Now, Milton Friedman obviously starts the book with an immediate attack and a jab at the idea that spending, so government spending, can directly decrease unemployment, and it can just be used as an easy and effective stimulus all the time to erode unemployment. He just claims that this is absolutely false, as obviously when government money is spent, it has to come from somewhere. It has to either be taxed, it has to be raised as debt, or it has to be inflated out of the currency. Now, if it's taxed, obviously you've taken that money from somewhere else, somewhere where that money would have either been spent by a consumer or used by a business to then probably hire more people or to do more business that results in people being hired anyway. So ultimately, when the government tries to raise its spending to then hire people and to reduce unemployment, it's inadvertently increasing unemployment in the private sector while having public sector or public sector related businesses hire more people that then shows, reduced unemployment to some degree in that aspect. So it's just moving money from a more efficient place to a less efficient place to complete the same goal. And this is exactly why Milton Friedman is completely anti big government and is just looking for have the smallest possible, just highly operationally efficient government, because each unit of currency that is moved over to the government to then use for its own goals is ultimately taken from the free market, where it's by definition done more effectively than when it's in the hands of the government. He then goes on to make continuous jabs at John Maynard Keynes and Keynesianism principles in general. And he does this probably for about half of the chapter. So I'm going to just, knock everything down to the key points for you guys. So Keynesianism as an ultimate theory is all about smoothing out the market, the highs and the lows, skimming off the top, running budget surpluses when the economy is booming, and then when the economy is in recession or in a downturn, spending that money to then stimulate the economy to bring it out of that recession. Now, there's two huge flaws here, which are firstly, when looking at economic data, you are relying on out of date data because you've had to measure what's happened in the economy, which means that it is by definition previous data, maybe for the last 3 months or so. So you're already acting on past data for the future, which means you may not even still be in the recession or downturn that you think that you're in. And also, when particularly a democratic country has to action these things, it has to send it through Parliament or through Congress to authorize the spending of this money to then stimulate the economy. By the time that's actually done, the money's been approved, the money has been gathered, the money has been spent. A year might have passed, and by which time you might actually not even be in a recession. Even worse, you might be in a boom that you've just overstimulated and you've done the exact opposite of what you've then set out to do, doing the opposite of, stabilizing the economy, make it even more unstable. And that's historically what's been proven to have been done a lot through Keynesian principles. And furthermore, it's just politically a nightmare, and that's because it's politically unpopular to then run the surpluses to dampen the economic growth and to stop the boom. So what do countries do? They ultimately just continue to push for economic growth that isn't warranted, that's impossible to achieve naturally, by taking on endless debt. So they'll just constantly run budget deficits instead of surpluses to then accumulate, this rampant amounts of debt to push economic growth as far as they possibly can, because no politician wants to be the person to suffer short-term consequences for long-term gains. If they've been elected for 4 or 5 years, the last thing they want to do is make those 4 or 5 years problematic and a struggle for the voter, to then have huge benefits for the next generation, because the next generation doesn't matter because they're going to be out of office. So politically, effective Keynesianism principles don't even really work. And Milton Friedman really digs into this point. And rather than smoothing the cycles, you're ultimately magnifying them anyway. So it's just very inefficient from every single realm, because you're doing something that's ineffective for the economy and you're doing it ultimately to meet political goals. And politics and economics, in terms of the goals and the consequences, tend to be completely inverse, because you tend to push for short term benefits to appeal politically, which tends to be horrible with long-term economic consequences. And in real life, we can see this all around the world. In my home country, in the UK, we haven't run a budget surplus in 25 years. That's a quarter of a century. Are we meant to be saying that we've been in a recession for 25 years that we've been trying to get out of? Or are we saying that the governments that we've had over the past 25 years have been so desperate to be popular and so desperate not to force us into a recession or into any worse recessions than we've already had, that they've just been accumulating debt and increasing budget spending to then make things kind of just as good as they possibly can be at the time, rather than actually thinking in the long term about consequences and what's actually best for the future of our economy? Because economic discipline is very unpopular because the benefits do come much, much later of making sure that the government, say, has very, very minimal or controllable levels of debt compared to, taking as much debt as you can because you're only going to be in government for 4 or 5 years. So, make hay while the sun shines. So Milton Friedman ultimately rounds off this chapter by making the point that the government should not be worried about the whole economy. The government should stabilize and control their own budget. They should be efficient in themselves and run effectively or as effectively as they possibly can. And rather than trying to smooth cycles, just letting the economy play out as it's designed to do. Because we've got this really efficient mechanism, we've made the most effective mechanism in history. And there's no point in us trying to then manipulate it, thinking that we're smarter than the system is itself. And he plays devil's advocate at one point, which I find quite funny. But he says that in Keynesianism, the whole idea of smoothing the economy by highs and lows and skimming off the top and pumping at the bottom by essentially raising taxes and pushing out revenue. Well, without raising taxes, technically just raising debt to then spend money. He says, well, surely it makes more sense to raise or decrease taxes. To raise taxes in a boom or to decrease taxes in a bust. And why is that? That's because the money actually goes directly into the pockets of the people you're looking to help, the members of the public. Because if the government just spends money, that money is typically extremely efficient. It will go to places that don't necessarily benefit the public because the public otherwise would have been pushing to have money spent on these things anyway. So if you're going to have excess money pumped into the economy, he says, why not just cut taxes for people so they actually receive the money and they're able to spend it as they wish? Which I think is a very interesting point of view, considering that he's kind of making a point that's for an argument that he's completely against. But nonetheless, I think it's extremely insightful and very interesting, and probably far more efficient than the basic Keynesian theorem of just spending money as soon as you can or whenever you can to actually cut taxes and to allow the population to keep more of that money, which they can then spend to stimulate the economy in places that they want to spend it. But overall, the usual the usual lesson we get from every single chapter when reading on Milton Friedman: leave the economy alone and let it do its own work while managing your own responsibilities in terms of making sure that we're aiding the economy to be as efficient as it possibly can. Now, any questions that you have, let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching.